I was always the first one in and the last one to leave. That wasn't just a habit, it became my identity over 11 years at Orion Systems, a company I helped build from a fragile idea into a multi-million-dollar platform, while others arrived with coffee in hand and left right at 5. I stayed behind the curtain, quietly making sure everything worked the way it was supposed to. My name is Ophelia Reed, and if you asked anyone outside the company who built our core system, they would probably say Daniel Carter, our charismatic CEO. He was the face, the voice, the visionary, but I was the one who wrote the backbone of everything he proudly showcased. Every late-night debugging session, every weekend rewriting broken code rushed out by inexperienced developers, every last-minute fix before major client demos, that was me. My title said Senior Software Engineer, but in reality, I was the one holding everything together. I trained new hires who barely understood the system, calmed frustrated clients when things went wrong, and even stepped in to fix presentations minutes before investor meetings. Sometimes, I felt less like an engineer and more like the glue no one noticed until it was gone. The team treated me politely, sure, but never as an equal. I'd speak in meetings, only to be interrupted. I'd suggest solutions, then watch someone else repeat my exact words minutes later and receive all the praise. And Daniel, he'd laugh, clap them on the back, and call it initiative. I stopped correcting them after a while, because deep down, I knew the truth didn't matter here. What mattered was who got seen, and I was never meant to be seen. Before we go on, take a second to subscribe, but only if you believe in knowing your true value and not letting others define it. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from? And what's the temperature like there right now? Just a quick note, this is a fictional story. Some details are enhanced with AI for storytelling purposes. It's created for inspiration and entertainment, not aimed at any real person or company. Now, let me continue the story. At first, I told myself it was temporary. That recognition would come eventually if I just kept delivering, kept proving myself, kept being reliable in ways no one else could. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Promotions started going to people who had been there a fraction of the time I had. Men Daniel played golf with, laughed with, had drinks with after work. They were given titles, raises, and visibility, while I was handed more responsibility with the same quiet expectation that I would handle it. Like I always did, I became the unofficial lead on multiple projects without ever being given the title. When systems failed, I was the one called in to fix them. When deadlines slipped, I was the one who stayed overnight to get everything back on track. When new hires joined, I trained them patiently, walking them through a system I had built. While they asked questions that made it painfully clear how little they understood, still, their names appeared in updates. Their progress was celebrated. Mine was assumed. There were weeks when I barely left the office before midnight. I rewrote unstable features, coordinated between teams that couldn't communicate, and stepped in during client escalations when things were on the verge of collapse. I even found myself reworking investor presentation slides minutes before meetings, smoothing over technical gaps so Daniel could stand confidently in front of a room and take credit for a flawless system. 3 years passed without a meaningful raise. Not once did anyone sit me down and say, "We see what you're doing." Instead, I got polite nods, occasional thanks, empty acknowledgments that vanished as quickly as they were spoken. And the more I gave, the more invisible I became. It wasn't just unfair anymore, it was expected. Then, slowly, something shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. No announcement, no direct confrontation, just small changes that didn't seem connected until they started forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. Daniel stopped asking for my input. Meetings I used to lead suddenly happened without me. Updates I had always been part of were now summarized to me afterward, like I was someone on the outside trying to catch up. At first, I thought it was just timing, maybe a scheduling conflict, but then it kept happening. And then there was Ethan Cole. He had joined less than a year ago, confident, well-spoken, and completely out of his depth when it came to the actual architecture of our system. Yet somehow, he was the one Daniel started putting forward. Ethan began leading team calls, presenting progress updates, even speaking on technical decisions he barely understood. I sat in those meetings, listening as he explained simplified versions of systems I had spent years building. Occasionally, he'd glance at me for confirmation, and I'd nod, not because he was right, but because correcting him would only create friction I no longer had the energy for. At the same time, a new wave of interns appeared, young, inexperienced, and completely unprepared for the level of access they were being given. Daniel insisted they were learning opportunities, but I saw something else. They hovered around his office, eager to impress, assigned tasks that should have never been handed to beginners. One afternoon, I caught an intern trying to access a live production database with admin privileges when I asked who approved it. She smiled nervously and said Daniel told her to explore. That was the moment something in my chest tightened. This wasn't just mismanagement. It felt like carelessness, or worse, replacement. Because while I was still there, still doing the work, the structure around me was changing, and for the first time in 11 years. I realized I might already be on my way out. I didn't confront anyone, not Daniel, not Ethan, not even HR. Though I noticed the quiet conversations, the closed doors, the way voices lowered when I walked past. Instead, I did what I had always done. I kept working. The investor demo was only days away, and every critical component of it ran through systems I had designed. If anything failed, it wouldn't just reflect on the company, it would reflect on me. And despite everything, I wasn't willing to let my work collapse because of someone else's decisions, so I stayed late every night that week. The office would empty out, lights dimming one section at a time, until it was just me and the quiet hum of the servers. I went through everything with precision: deployment scripts, security layers, failover sequences. I tested edge cases no one else even thought about. I built redundancies on top of redundancies, making sure the system could survive pressure, mistakes, even incompetence. Because deep down, I no longer trusted the people around me to protect what I had built. There was a kind of clarity in that realization. One night, long after midnight, I opened a file I hadn't touched in months. It wasn't part of the demo, and it wasn't something anyone else even knew existed. Just a small, quiet piece of logic buried deep within the system's infrastructure. Back when I first wrote it, I told myself it was just a safeguard, a contingency, a way to ensure that if access to the system was ever transferred or mishandled, the integrity of the architecture would remain intact. It didn't delete anything. It didn't corrupt data. It simply restricted control. At the time, I never imagined I would actually need it. But now, staring at those lines of code, I understood why I had written them. Not out of suspicion, out of instinct. I didn't activate anything. I didn't change a single parameter. I just made sure it was still there and ready. Monday arrived with a strange stillness. Daniel walked into the development floor that morning, something he rarely did anymore. He glanced around like he was inspecting property rather than people, then stopped at my desk. I had just finished the final checks on the demo environment. Everything was stable, clean, ready. He asked a few surface-level questions, barely listening to the answers. Then, almost casually, he mentioned that Ethan would be leading the investor presentation. Not me. I looked at him for a second longer than usual. I built the entire demo flow, I said calmly. Daniel gave a short laugh, almost amused. Yeah, but investors don't want to hear from someone who goes too deep into technical details. We need someone more presentable. Presentable? I nodded slowly, even though something inside me tightened. By the afternoon, the atmosphere had changed again. HR was unusually active, doors closing, conversations cutting short when I walked by. At exactly 4:30 p.m., an email appeared in my inbox. Meeting request, 5 p.m. No subject, no details. I didn't hesitate. I saved my work, closed everything down, and walked to the conference room. Daniel was already there, sitting beside the HR director. Neither of them looked comfortable, but neither avoided what they had planned. He spoke first, using a tone that felt rehearsed. Detached. The company is restructuring, and frankly, we need people who can evolve with where we're going. I said nothing, he continued, leaning back slightly. You've been here a long time. Ophelia, sometimes that kind of routine thinking becomes a limitation. A limitation. The HR director slid a folder across the table, mentioning severance, paperwork, next steps. Her voice was polite, distant, like she was reading from a script she had memorized too well. Daniel added one more line, softer but sharper. Let's be honest. What you built was useful, but it's not irreplaceable. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply nodded. Daniel shifted in his seat, finally meeting my eyes for a brief second. I trust you'll handle this professionally. No scenes, no complications. Of course. I placed my company laptop on the table and gently pushed it toward him. Everything was there. The demo, the system. Every piece functioning exactly as it should. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. I hope the presentation goes smoothly, I said. Then I stood, turned, and walked out without looking back. Behind me, something had already begun. If you believe Daniel Carter was right to fire someone he deemed no longer valuable, feel free to comment, agree. But if you think his decision was a mistake stemming from ego and short-sighted judgment, feel free to write, idiot. I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in 11 years, I was no longer part of Arion Systems. I stepped out into the evening air, walked a few blocks, and settled into a quiet cafe across the street. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone right away. I just sat there, letting the silence settle in. 10 minutes. That's how long it took. The trigger was simple. My admin credentials revoked. The system recognizing a shift in control. A small piece of logic, buried deep within the infrastructure. Finally woke up. It didn't destroy anything. It didn't erase data. It just closed the door. The first alert came through moments later. System integrity check failed. Then another. Authorization loop detected. I flipped my phone over as messages started piling in. One from a junior engineer. Liam, hey, something's wrong. We can't access the demo environment. Ethan's login isn't working. And now everything's locked in read-only mode. Did anything change before you left? I typed back calmly. No changes on my end. Back at the office. I could already picture it. Ethan sitting at my desk, trying to run a system he didn't understand, screens flashing error messages, scripts failing one after another. The more they tried to fix it, the worse it looked, because the system wasn't broken. It was protected. Daniel would be pacing, demanding answers, expecting someone to step in and fix it like always. But there was no one left who knew how. Every layer, every dependency, every safeguard, they all traced back to me. And without the key. The entire demo was nothing more than a locked door in front of a room full of investors. My phone started vibrating nonstop. First a message, then another, then calls, one after the other, stacking on top of each other like urgency could somehow force a response. Daniel. I let it ring. A few seconds later, a text came through. What's going on? Call me. Now? I stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it without replying. Minutes passed. More messages. The system is down. Investors are here. This isn't funny. Then, a shift in tone. Ophelia, if you made any changes, we need to fix this immediately. Call me. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Another call. This time, I let it go to voicemail. His voice sounded different, tighter, less controlled. Listen, I don't know what happened, but we need you back here. Just come in, fix whatever this is, and we'll talk. We can work something out. Work something out. I almost smiled. 11 years of silence. 11 years of being overlooked, dismissed, replaced piece by piece. And now, suddenly, I was someone worth negotiating with. More messages came in, each one more urgent than the last. I'm serious. We can discuss your position. Whatever you want, title. Salary, anything. Just fix this. There it was. Not respect, not recognition, desperation. I leaned back in my chair, watching people pass by outside the cafe window, completely unaware that somewhere across the street, a company was unraveling. For a brief moment, I considered answering, not for Daniel, but for the team, for the engineers who were now stuck dealing with something they didn't understand. But then I remembered the conference room, the way he spoke, the way he dismissed everything I had built as replaceable. I placed my phone face down on the table. If he wanted to talk, he should have done it before I walked out. Now, he would have to deal with the silence. By the next morning, the damage was no longer contained inside the office. It had spilled out. Liam called me early, his voice low, almost cautious. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't accuse. He just told me what was happening. The demo, it didn't work, he said. They tried everything. Ethan couldn't get past the main dashboard. Every action triggered errors. Investors were sitting there watching it fall apart in real time. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not in satisfaction, but in recognition. That's not even the worst part, he continued. Daniel kept saying it was a minor issue, a server sync delay, but no one believed him. One of the biggest investors walked out halfway through. I could picture it perfectly. The room, the tension, the forced smiles collapsing into silence. By the end, Liam added, they were just stalling. A few hours later, the headlines started appearing. At first, they were vague, careful. Orion Systems faces unexpected technical failure during key investor demo. Then sharper. Major backers reconsider support after Orion's presentation breakdown. By the afternoon, the tone had changed completely. Sources suggest internal mismanagement behind Orion Systems. Collapse. The narrative Daniel had controlled for years was slipping out of his hands. Messages started coming in from former colleagues, people who had already left, people who had seen the cracks long before I did. Short notes, quiet support. About time. I always knew something wasn't right there. You didn't deserve how they treated you. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was enough. Because for the first time, the story wasn't about the company's success. It was about everything they had tried to hide, and now, there was no one left to hold it together. That night, for the first time in years, I opened a folder I had almost forgotten existed. I had named it someday. Inside were sketches, system diagrams, half-finished ideas I had once been excited about before deadlines. Pressure and exhaustion buried them. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't built for investor slides or empty promises. It was something simpler, cleaner, a system designed for real people, not just metrics. A message popped up while I was scrolling through the files. Liam, I know this isn't my place, he wrote, but if you ever build something of your own, I'd like to be part of it. I stared at the screen for a moment, then replied with a simple line, let's talk. 2 days later, I met with Clara Hayes, a co-founder of a mid-sized tech firm that had been quietly gaining attention for doing things differently. She didn't ask me to fix her company. She didn't try to hire me into another version of the same system I had just left. She asked what I wanted to build, so I told her about a platform focused on clarity, security, and trust, a system that didn't hide behind complexity or exploit its users. Something honest. She listened, really listened. Then she said, if you can show me a working direction, I'll back it. That was all I needed. Liam and I started working the same night. No office, no titles, just a shared screen. Ideas flowing freely for the first time in years. He handled the front end with a kind of care I hadn't seen in a long time. I rebuilt the architecture from the ground up. We called it Root Line. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't building something for someone else to take credit for. 3 months later, Rootline was still small, but it was real. We weren't chasing headlines or inflated numbers. We focused on building something that worked, something people could actually rely on. Slowly, organizations began to notice. A local nonprofit used our platform to coordinate volunteers in a matter of hours. A small business reached out, saying it was the first tool they'd used that didn't feel confusing or manipulative. Each message meant more than any applause I had ever heard in a conference room. Liam and I found our rhythm. No hierarchy, no politics, just clarity. Decisions were made based on what made sense, not who spoke the loudest. For the first time in my career, I didn't feel the need to prove my worth every single day. It was already understood. News about Orion systems continued to surface, but now it felt distant. Leadership changes, internal conflicts, more employees leaving, articles questioning their culture, their management, their future. The company that once seemed untouchable was unraveling piece by piece. One morning, I came across a headline about another senior engineer resigning. Citing a toxic work environment and lack of recognition, I didn't feel satisfaction reading it. I felt clarity. It had never been about me not being enough. It had never been about needing to work harder or wait longer to be seen. The system itself had been broken. I closed the article and returned to my screen. There was still work to do, features to improve, people depending on what we were building now. That was where my focus belonged. I didn't need an apology from Daniel. I didn't need the company to collapse completely to feel validated. None of that would change what I had already learned. The real victory wasn't in watching something fall apart. It was in walking away and building something better, somewhere along the way. I stopped needing permission to matter, and in the end, that was more than enough. If you would have made the same choice as I did, walking away and building something better, just comment I support you, so I know I wasn't wrong. But if you would have chosen a different path, maybe stayed or fixed things from the inside, feel free to write stay. My story ends here, but I know many of you have your own. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or replaced share your story, I'm listening. Looking back, I realized the hardest lesson wasn't about losing a job, it was about understanding my own worth. For years, I believed that working harder, staying quieter, and being dependable would eventually earn me recognition. But the truth is, if you stay in a place that refuses to see your value, no amount of effort will change that. What changed everything for me wasn't revenge. It was the decision to walk away and build something where I could finally be seen, heard, and respected. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's because a part of you has felt the same way. And that means you're not invisible, you're just in the wrong place. If you believe in knowing your worth and creating something better for yourself, consider subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like if this story spoke to you, and send it to someone who might need to hear this today. Your voice matters more than you think, and together, we can build a community where no one feels overlooked again. Wishing you the courage to choose yourself. Always.